Morning, church. We were able to go out to Eddie Warrior on Friday for our monthly baptisms, and God blessed us with 6 ladies who were baptized into Christ. So God continues to really bless that ministry, and thanks to so many of you who are participating in it. If you would like to, please let Henry or Glenn or Betty know. They'd love to have the help, and we can use all the help we can get. Also, I would ask for your prayers. Glenn Elliott and I will be traveling to Colombia this week. We are supporting a work in Santa Marta, Colombia. The Cabrera family there are doing excellent work. We just got a report the other day that showed over the last few months they've had 16 baptisms. They had photos of the baptisms that were taking place, and God is really blessing that work, and it's growing, doing well. And so we're going to go down there. Bob Young is going to be down there with us, and we're going to be surveying that work and seeing what we can do. Hopefully, in the next year or two, we'll be able to take a group down there and work with the church there in Santa Marta. So please keep us in your prayers. We'll leave on Thursday. We'll be back the next Tuesday. We have spent 3 weeks talking about Ruth and looking at the beautiful book that Ruth is, with a beautiful theme of light and darkness, and God's providence and care, and the beauty of character and love. There are just so many things to take from the book of Ruth. This morning, I would like for us to begin to spend a couple of weeks looking at the book of Esther, and especially we'll be looking at 2 themes. One is the providence of God as revealed in Esther, and the other is deliverance of God. We'll be expanding upon that as we go into the book. You know, I think we have a tendency to kind of tiptoe around providence. We tiptoe it around, I think, because it appears kind of squishy and subjective. How do I know that it was God working in my life? How do I know that it was God doing this or that? And it seems like that we're more comfortable talking in terms of chance and coincidence and luck than we are talking about God's working in our lives and His providence. And I would argue that as Christians, some of the words that we probably need to eliminate from our conversation would be coincidence and luck. Because I don't believe in coincidence and luck. I believe in the providence of God and God working in our lives, and that is made no clearer anywhere than it is in the book of Esther. I believe if we rob God of His glory and ourselves, if we do this, we rob God of His glory and ourselves of the comfort and blessing of recognizing His work in our lives. Now, in Esther again, there are 2 interwoven themes that we'll find throughout the book. Those interwoven themes are providence and deliverance. These placed within the context, really, I believe that one of the main purposes of this book being written is to tell us about the Feast of Purim. And we'll be talking more about that in a little bit, and the origins of the Feast of Purim. There can be no deliverance without providence, and you'll really see this illustrated in the book of Esther. God's not mentioned as Esther, but His fingerprints all over the book. And I would strenuously argue that God's not mentioned in the book of Esther for a reason. It's because He wants us to see that whether people recognize His presence or not, whether people recognize His working or not, that doesn't mean His presence isn't there, and that doesn't mean that He's not working, because He is. And it's really made clear in this beautiful little book of Esther. Now, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the book of Esther. It would take too long to read the book, and so what I want to do now is take a few minutes and kind of give you a condensed version of what we're told in the book of Esther, and then I want us to draw some very important lessons from the story of the book of Esther. Now, a king by the name of Xerxes, he's also known as Ahasuerus, comes to the throne of the Medo-Persian Empire in 486 BC. Now, the Medo-Persian Empire is a dominant force in the Middle East at that time. In fact, from India all the way down to North Africa, the Medo-Persians hold sway. It is a huge empire. And when Ahasuerus comes to the throne, he takes a position as arguably one of the most powerful men in the whole world. Now, he's ambitious, and he wants to expand the borders of the Medo-Persian Empire. And so 3 years into his reign, around 483 BC, he starts summoning leaders from all over the empire to come to Susa, which is the capital of the Medo-Persian Empire. Now, he will spend 6 months trying to persuade these men to support an effort to put together the biggest army probably that's ever been seen up to that time, and march that army east and expand the borders of the Medo-Persian Empire into Europe. He wants to take Greece, he wants to move in that direction. After 6 months, he throws a party that lasts a week, and he invites everybody in Susa to come. Now, he's doing all this to impress these people, these representatives from all over the empire, to get them to support him in his efforts, because the Medo-Persian Empire is kind of an amalgam of a lot of different peoples and all, and he's got to get them all to cooperate to do this. So he's trying to impress them. So he puts on this huge show of luxury and so on. Now, at the end of this 1 week feast, he calls on his queen Vashti to come out. He wants to show her off. Now, she says no. Now, why she says no, we're not sure, because the text doesn't tell us. There are some scholars who say that they think that what he wanted to do was bring Vashti out unclothed and show her beauty off to all these people who were there. Regardless of exactly what his motivation is, she says, no, I'm not going to do it. Now, here you are trying to persuade leaders from all over the kingdom to back you as a supreme leader and support you in this war effort to expand the borders of the kingdom to the east, and you can't even get your wife to do what you tell her to do. Do you understand the egg on his face? Now, I'm not disagreeing with Vashti, by the way, at all, in saying no. But boy, it puts him in a pickle. And so his advisors come, and they say, well, here's what you're going to have to do. What you're going to have to do is divorce this woman, banish her from your presence, and make it very clear that this kind of rebellion is not going to be tolerated. And so that's what he does. Now, this is important because of how things are going to play out. There are some chronological indicators in the book that you really need to pay close attention to, because they figure prominently in what happens. This is in the 3rd year of his reign, okay? The next time you run across a chronological indicator, it's in the 7th year of his reign. 4 years have gone by. And the writer doesn't explain to you that in that 4 years, from 483 to 479 BC, he has been attempting to put this army together and march east and take Europe. And he doesn't succeed. In fact, he comes back whipped, defeated, unable to do that. And oh, by the way, that has huge implications for you and me. Because if he had succeeded in moving into Europe like he wanted to, it would probably have changed history and changed our history as well. But he's defeated. And he comes back, and he's probably down and funky. And so his advisors say, hey, here, why don't you need to replace the queen. It's been 4 years. You need to replace the queen. Why don't we have this huge empire-wide beauty pageant? And we'll select women, the most beautiful young virgins from all over the empire, and we'll bring them in, and we'll let you choose a new queen. What do you think? Oh, he likes that idea. And so that's what they do. One of the girls that gets caught up in this is named Hadassah. Hadassah is also called Aster or Esther. Esther's brought into the king's harem, and for about a year, she's primped, and all these rituals are gone through because, hey, if you go into the king, you go into a god, as far as they're concerned. It is a big deal to come into the presence of the king. I'll talk more about that in a little bit. When it comes her time to take part in this really kind of a sick deal, because these women are brought in, they sleep with him one night. If he doesn't accept them, then they go into his harem and they'll spend the rest of their life in his harem. They may never see him again. They're cut off from society. Now, they'll live in luxury, but it's a luxurious prison. That's what it is. But we find Esther, when she's called and she sleeps with the king decides she's the one. And so in the 7th year of his reign, he marries her. And this little Jewish girl, who, by the way, has lost her mom and daddy, she's been raised by her cousin. She has a cousin named Mordecai. And Mordecai's raised her like a daughter. Well, now this young Jewish girl is married to the most powerful man maybe in the world at that time. Now, Mordecai has some kind of ties to the royal palace. Exactly what his role is isn't made clear early in Esther, but he has connections there. He's very concerned about Esther, wanting to keep up with what's going on with her. Now, he can't see her, okay? But he apparently has connections with eunuchs in the harem who can convey messages back and forth. While he's around the king's palace, he hears that there are a couple of these eunuchs who want to murder, assassinate Ahasuerus, Xerxes. And so he sends that message to Esther, and he tells Esther, tell the king that these two guys want to kill him. There's a plot against his life. Xerxes checks it out, finds out that it's true, and has these two guys executed. And this is going to be a big deal later on, so keep it in mind. Now, you jump 5 years, okay? So now we're 12 years into the reign of this guy who will reign 21 years. So you jump another 7 years. And we find that now there's a guy by the name of Haman who has become very influential with Xerxes, probably the second most powerful man in the kingdom. Haman is identified as an Agagite. Now that means that he's an Amalekite. Agag was one of the kings of the Amalekites. And if you're familiar with the relationship between the Jews and the Amalekites in the Old Testament, it's not good. One of the first people to attack the Israelites when they left Egypt were the Amalekites. They hate each other, okay? Now, Haman has an ego that is outlandish. I mean, this man, you talk about a narcissist. This guy is a narcissist. And Mordecai, because he's a Jew, and I assume because Haman is an Amalekite, Mordecai won't bow down to him. Mordecai won't acknowledge this great man. That just goes all over Haman. He can't stand it. And so Haman decides that he's going to kill Mordecai. No, I'm going to do better than that. I'm not just going to kill Mordecai. I'm going to kill all of Mordecai's people. Mordecai's a Jew. I'm going to see to it that the Jews in the kingdom are wiped out. They're destroyed. As he goes to Xerxes and he says, Xerxes, there's a people living among you that are awful. And they're a threat to you, and we just need to get rid of them. And I'm willing to see to it that that happens because I care so much about you. And I'm even willing to spend a not small fortune, 10,000 talents, brothers and sisters. That's an unimaginable amount of money. I'm willing to spend 10,000 talents to see that this takes place. And Xerxes says, fine, go ahead. You have my permission. Apparently he doesn't question him, doesn't check into this further, trust Haman. And so, Haman gets together with his advisors, and they throw the pur. Now, the pur are lots, okay, like dice. And this is significant, again, because of what happens later. So keep in mind the word pur. So they throw the pur, and they throw the pur, and they throw the pur. And finally, according to the lots, the date to destroy the Jews will be March 7th of 472. That's going to be the date to do it. That's 11 months off. And so Haman issues an edict. It's got the king's imprint on it. And this edict says that on that date, anybody in the empire that wants to kill Jews and take their stuff can do it with no repercussions. Now just imagine if suddenly our government, for some reason, sent out an edict and said, if you were born in Oklahoma, in September of next year, anybody in this country that wants to kill you and take your stuff can. How would you feel? You can imagine how the Jews feel. Man, it's like a bomb's been dropped in the middle of them. Mordecai goes into mourning over it. Tears his garments. He's in mourning outside the king's castle. One of the eunuchs tells Esther, Mordecai's in mourning. Now, Esther, please understand, she is cut off from everything. She doesn't see anybody unless the king allows it. All right? She is sequestered like you wouldn't believe. Now, she's sequestered in luxury, but she's sequestered. Mordecai sends a message into her and tells her, listen, this is the edict the king has sent out. You have got to do something. And she sends back to him and she says, hey, I haven't seen Xerxes' face in 30 days. If I just walk in on him and he's in a bad mood or whatever, if he doesn't extend his scepter to me, I die. That's right. I mean, nobody walks in on the king unannounced without him accepting him. If he doesn't, you die, including the queen. Mordecai sends back to her, chapter 4, verse 14, and he says, how do you know that you have not been put in this position for such a time as this? She sends back to him, for the next 3 days, would you not eat or drink, and would you pray? Everybody with me and myself are going to do the same thing, and then I'll approach the king. So for 3 days and nights, they fast, they don't eat, they don't drink. And then Esther dresses herself up in her royal robes, and she goes and she stands just outside the royal room, but where the king can see her. Now, if the king's in a bad mood or whatever, who knows? But the king sees her, come on in, honey. Has her come in. What do you want? He's in an ebullient mood. Up to half the kingdom, it'll be yours. What do you want? She says, all I want to do is ask you and Haman to come to dinner with me. Okay. So, Haman hears about this, and as he heads home, he walks by Mordecai. Mordecai's not bowing down to him. He is furious about Mordecai. So when he gets home, he's bragging to his wife and his kids, and he's saying, hey, the queen is going to serve supper, and only the king and myself have been invited. Aren't I something? But this Mordecai, he's just driving me crazy. And so they say, well, kill him. Kill him. And so he goes, let's build a gallows, get this, 75 feet tall. Now think about that. 7.5 stories tall. Let's build this gallows and I'll hang him on it. And that's going to send a message to everybody in the Medo-Persian Empire, don't mess with Haman. Now that night, while they're building the gallows and Haman's bragging and feeling good about himself, the king can't sleep. He's got a case of royal insomnia. He's up, and so he calls in one of his scribes and he said, I want you to read to me from the records. And I believe not coincidentally, not accidentally, not by chance, the guy opens up the book and he reads from 5 years before. And he reads about how these two guys had plotted to kill Xerxes, and Mordecai had reported it, and the king had found out about it and had executed the two men responsible. And the king says, well, now, what did we do for Mordecai? And the scribe says, well, I can't find that we did anything. Well, about that time, early in the morning, here comes Haman. Haman's wanting to get permission to execute Mordecai on this gallows he's having built. And he comes into the room and the king says, Haman, what would you do for a man that you wanted to honor? A man that you really appreciated? How would you recommend that I treat him? Well, in Haman's mind, there's only one person in the world like that, and that's him. So he says, well, I would have him dressed in royal robes, and I would have him put on a horse, and I would have somebody very important lead him around the city, telling everybody, this is how the king treats people that he finds in great favor. Love this. Xerxes says, okay, go do that for Mordecai. And so Haman, can you imagine how he looks? He has to go out there, has to put the royal robes on Mordecai, has to lead him around, saying, I'm sure with great verb, this is how the king honors somebody that he holds in great favor. And then he goes home and he whines to his wife, and his wife, a pretty astute lady, says, sounds like you're in trouble, bud. Sounds like maybe the Jews are in favor. Now that night, Esther's invited him back for a supper, and she has told the king, at supper, I'll tell you what I want. And so Haman and the king come to Esther's quarters, and she serves him supper, and then the king says, okay, now what do you want? And she says, listen, I wouldn't even bring this up. If it just meant that I was going to be a slave and all my people were going to be slaves, I wouldn't bother you with this. But this guy wants to destroy us, annihilate us, kill all of us. And so I'm begging you for our lives. Well, now when Xerxes figures out what Haman had pulled and what he had done, he is so angry that he storms out of the room. Haman, thinking, I'm a dead man, decides to plead for his life with Esther and throws himself on the couch before her to plead with her. About that time, back in walks the king. And the king says, oh, not only do you want to destroy these people, not only do you pull the wool over my, you're attacking my wife. And he has him taken out and hanged on the same gallows that he was going to hang Mordecai on. Now Mordecai is now in great favor with the king. And so Mordecai and Esther basically ask the king, would you please undo this order that you've put out? It's still like about 8 months or so before this will take place, okay? Would you please rescind the order? And the king says, I can't do that. And that's true. If you read in Daniel chapter 6, same situation. Once the king of the Medes and Persians puts out an order, it cannot be rescinded. Can't be undone. Now, if you think about it, there's great wisdom in that. Should that cause you to think twice before you pass a law? If you can never repeal the law? Anyway, he says, but if you figure something out, you've got my imprint, you can do it. So what Mordecai does is sit down and he writes out an edict from the king which says, on the 7th day of March next year, the Jews are now authorized to fight back. Anybody who tries to take their stuff, they can fight back and have their stuff. Well, word goes out across the empire, and immediately across the empire, people are going, ooh, boy, is this a change? Is this a reversal? And it says a lot of people even choose to become Jews because of this edict, because this says that they are now in the king's favor. Come March 7th of the next year, sure enough, there are those that attack the Jews. But the Jews are ready, and the Jews have royal permission to fight back. It's a disaster for those who choose to attack the Jews. Thousands of them die. In fact, there's so much stuff that goes on that they ask for an extra day and they get it. And there's a fighting on a second day, the 8th of March. But at the end of it, all these enemies of the Jews have been wiped out. And the Jews have been delivered as a people. So Mordecai says, we need to have a feast and celebrate this deliverance. And they call it the Feast of Purim. Using that title for casting the lots that set it on that date, we'll call it the Feast of Purim. Now, brothers and sisters, that was almost 2,500 years ago. Today, the Jews still observe the Feast of Purim. Go look it up. Next year on March 9th and March 10th, calendar varies a little bit. Next year, March 9th and March 10th will be the Feast of Purim for the Jews. And they will celebrate their deliverance all that long time ago from the destruction planned for them by Haman. And there will be all kinds of plays done and readings read and this kind of thing. In fact, one of the favorite things they do is they read the book of Esther, and every time Haman's name comes up, all the kids hiss and boo. He's the bad guy, and that's part of their tradition. They hiss and boo when his name comes up. But that's the story of the book of Esther. Now, from this, let me draw a couple of I think, of very important points. First of all, consider this cascade of events. Did this just happen? Was this coincidence, or don't you see in this the hand of God working? Let's start with the downfall of Vashti. If Vashti hadn't done what she did and hadn't been banished from the king's presence, there would have never been an opportunity for this little Jewish girl to have any influence whatsoever. The recommendation in chapter 2, verses 1 through 18 of that beauty contest, which will result in her being chosen as queen, is critical to what happens. Esther would never have been in a position to influence the king had that not taken place. Mordecai overhearing that plot against the king, if he hadn't overheard that plot and reported it, the history of all of this would have been much, much different. The king's insomnia the night before Mordecai's execution is scheduled. If the king hadn't had insomnia, and even more importantly, if out of think about all the years it could have been read from, all the records that could have been picked out, he just happens to pick out the record that makes reference to what Mordecai had reported to the king 5 years before. It's critically important. Haman's entry, as the king wonders how to honor Mordecai in chapter 6, verse 6. And then finally, the king's return just as Haman falls on Esther's couch in chapter 7, verse 8. If that cascade of events hadn't occurred as they occurred, the Jews would not have been delivered. All that had to happen. And that is way too many coinky-dinks for me. Okay? That is very much the hand of God working to bring about the deliverance of the people of Israel. Now, within Esther are repeated inferences of God's providence. Mordecai's statement to Esther, for such a time as this, clearly he's saying, don't you think that maybe you've been put here for a reason? And of course, she had. Esther's call for a fast in chapter 4, verse 16. Now, she doesn't mention God, but why do they fast for 3 days and nights? Look at the context of fasting and how often is it tied to communicating with God and seeking His power and deliverance. Haman's wife predicting his coming downfall in the conflict with Mordecai. As I told you earlier, I think there again is a clear inference. She's saying, whoops, it looks like some hand is moving against you and for the Jews here, because it was. And so over and over again in the book of Esther, I think you see God's imprint. You see his hand working. Not specifically mentioned, but again, I think for a reason. So you can see and know that even if God's name's not being mentioned, that doesn't mean that God's not working for his people. In conclusion, when we recognize God's providence, real quickly, number one, we honor him. Why are people so quick to blame God when something goes bad, but not so quick to honor him when things go good? Have you ever thought about that? People sure like to blame God, but they don't like to honor God. Why not? When things happen in our lives in a positive way, why shouldn't we give honor to God for blessing us? When we recognize God's providence, we strengthen our faith. If you look in the rearview mirror of your life, any of us can, and you see God's hand working, bringing things about, and you have to look in the rearview mirror to see it. But if you do, what's it say? Well, if he's been working in my life up to now, why would he stop? Isn't he going to continue to do so? And so I want you to consider how God has worked in your life. And I want you to think about what he's done to bring you to this point in your life. The ways in which he's blessed you and guided you and been with you. What tremendous comfort and peace that brings. We can trust in the providence of God. This morning, if we can help you in your walk with God in some way, whether it's to begin that walk in baptism, or if we can encourage you by praying with you, if we can help you in any way, won't you come while we stand and while we sing?
Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. Cast me not away from your presence, O Lord. Take not your Holy Spirit from me. Restore unto me the joy of my salvation, and renew my spirit within me. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew my spirit within me. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew my spirit within me. Cast me not away from your presence, O Lord, and take not your Holy Spirit from me. Restore unto me the joy of my salvation, and renew my spirit within me.